42 men climbed into their cockpits that morning, not knowing that history was about to swallow them whole. They were the best trained naval aviators on the planet, flying the most sophisticated carrier-based aircraft the United States had ever built, launching from the decks of the most powerful warships in the history of human civilization. And in 30 minutes, the sky above Haiphong Harbor would turn into something that none of their training, none of their briefings, none of their combat experience had fully prepared them for. 80 surface-to-air missiles in 30 minutes, thousands of anti-aircraft artillery rounds filling every cubic meter of sky between them and their targets. A defensive wall so thick, so precisely engineered, so overwhelmingly concentrated that the mathematics of survival had essentially ceased to function in any meaningful way. This is April 19, 1972. This is Black Sunday. And this is the story that the Pentagon spent years making sure you would never fully understand. The Vietnam War, by the spring of 1972, was in its 7th year of American combat involvement. 7 years of jungle fighting, of napalm and body counts, of protests and politics, of young men coming home in flag-draped coffins or not coming home at all. The country was exhausted. The public was furious. Richard Nixon had won the presidency in 1968 on a promise to end the war, and had spent 4 years trying to find an exit that didn't look like defeat. The Paris peace negotiations were grinding along in fits and starts, always seeming to be on the verge of something real, and then collapsing back into stalemate. And the North Vietnamese, watching all of this with extraordinary patience and strategic clarity, had been waiting for the right moment, the right conditions, the right alignment of political, military, and meteorological factors to launch the operation they had been planning for more than a year. That moment came on March 30th, 1972. On the morning of March 30th, in the hours before dawn, more than 120,000 North Vietnamese Army troops crossed the demilitarized zone in a massive conventional assault that stunned American military planners with its scale, its coordination, and its ferocity. This was not guerrilla warfare. This was not the hit-and-run tactics of the Viet Cong. This was an armored offensive, Soviet-supplied tanks rolling south in columns, artillery barrages preceding infantry assaults, coordinated multi-axis attacks designed to collapse the South Vietnamese military and present the United States with a fait accompli that could not be reversed. The Easter Offensive, as it came to be known, was North Vietnam's bet that the military situation could be decided before American domestic politics allowed any serious response. Nixon responded with fury. He had withdrawn most American ground combat forces as part of his Vietnamization policy, meaning there were no longer sufficient American infantry units in South Vietnam to respond to a conventional assault of this magnitude. What Nixon had was air power, massive, carrier-based, land-based air power that could be directed against North Vietnamese forces with a speed and concentration that ground forces could not match. And more than that, Nixon made a decision that his predecessors had consistently refused to make. He decided to strike at the source, strike at Haiphong, strike at the port through which every tank, every artillery shell, every SAM missile the North Vietnamese were using had arrived. Cut the lifeline, strangle the offensive at its supply route. The decision to mine and strike Haiphong Harbor was one of the most consequential military decisions of the entire Vietnam War. For years, American military commanders had been requesting permission to attack Haiphong directly. For years, civilian leadership in Washington had refused, citing fears of international incident, fears of hitting Soviet or Chinese shipping, fears of escalation that might bring China into the war, the way China had entered the Korean War in 1950, turning a near victory into a catastrophic stalemate. Those fears had been real and legitimate. But by April of 1972, with South Vietnam facing potential military collapse, Nixon decided the risks of not acting outweighed the risks of acting. The order went out to Task Force 77, the United States 7th Fleet's carrier striking force operating in the Gulf of Tonkin. Haiphong was open for business, and the United States Navy was about to pay it a visit. Task Force 77, in April of 1972, was an extraordinary concentration of naval power. The carriers USS Coral Sea, USS Kitty Hawk, USS Constellation, and USS Hancock were all operating in the Gulf of Tonkin. Their flight decks crowded with aircraft that represented the cutting edge of American naval aviation. A-6 Intruder all-weather attack aircraft, capable of delivering precision strikes in conditions that would ground less sophisticated aircraft. A-7 Corsair II light attack aircraft, fast and agile, and carrying enough ordnance to do serious damage to well-defended targets. F-4 Phantom II fighters providing combat air patrol and suppression of enemy air defenses. EA-6 Prowler and EA-3 Skywarrior electronic warfare aircraft designed to jam North Vietnamese radar systems and disrupt their missile guidance. The full complement of carrier air power, coordinated and ready. What the strike planners were working against was not an unknown quantity. American intelligence had been watching Haiphong's air defenses develop for years. Reconnaissance aircraft had photographed every SAM site, every radar installation, every artillery battery that could be identified from the air. The picture that had emerged was deeply sobering. Haiphong, by April of 1972, was protected by an air defense system that had no meaningful parallel anywhere in the world outside of Moscow itself. The Soviets had supplied North Vietnam with their most capable air defense technologies. The SA-2 Guideline missile system, which had first shocked the world when it shot down Francis Gary Powers' U-2 over the Soviet Union in 1960, had been continuously upgraded and improved through the intervening 12 years. By 1972, the SA-2 batteries around Haiphong were operating with guidance systems, warhead detonation technologies, and crew proficiency levels that were fundamentally different from the systems that American aircraft had first encountered over North Vietnam in 1965. The SA-2 missile itself was a formidable weapon. Roughly 35 feet long, weighing nearly 5 tons at launch, it flew at speeds exceeding Mach 3 and could engage aircraft at altitudes from roughly 1,000 feet to over 60,000 feet. It was guided by radar command from the ground, with the launch crew tracking both the target aircraft and the missile simultaneously and sending steering corrections through a radio link. Against a non-maneuvering target, it was extraordinarily effective. Against an aircraft taking violent evasive action, it was less reliable, but the North Vietnamese had developed tactics to address exactly that problem. They fired their SAMs in salvos, multiple missiles aimed at the same target from slightly different angles, so that whatever direction the pilot turned to avoid one missile, another missile was waiting for him. This was called the three-ring firing doctrine, and it had been developed specifically to defeat American pilots who had learned to evade single SAM shots. Surrounding the SAM batteries was the artillery network, and if anything, the artillery was even more psychologically oppressive than the missiles because there was no individual missile to watch, no single threat to track and evade. The 85mm and 100mm guns fired shells fused to detonate at specific altitudes, creating expanding clouds of steel fragments at whatever height the American aircraft were flying. When the radar systems determined that attacking aircraft were at a certain altitude, the gun crews adjusted their fuse settings to detonate shells at precisely that altitude across the entire approach corridor. Flying into that kind of barrage was not like flying past anti-aircraft fire. It was like flying into a solid wall of exploding steel that happened to be suspended in the air across your entire path. The lighter automatic cannon, the 57mm and 37mm systems, added a visual dimension to the threat that the pilots found uniquely terrifying. These weapons produced visible tracers, and at the rates of fire they were capable of maintaining. The streams of tracers merged into what appeared to be continuous rivers of glowing light rising from the ground. Pilots who survived attacks through this kind of fire described it as looking like a solid thing, like trying to fly through a waterfall made of fire. And unlike the larger caliber guns, which were effective at medium and high altitudes, the lighter automatic weapons filled in the low-altitude threat space, meaning there was essentially no altitude band over Haiphong, where the threat went away. High altitude meant heavy SAMs and large caliber guns. Low altitude meant automatic cannons and missiles. Medium altitude meant all of them simultaneously. The men who planned the strike for April 19th were professionals doing their best with the information and assets they had. They structured the attack to arrive over the target from multiple directions simultaneously, trying to force the defenders to split their attention and prevent them from focusing their fire on any single axis of approach. Electronic warfare aircraft would fly ahead of and alongside the strike packages, jamming the radar frequencies used by the SAM guidance systems. Anti-radiation missiles, the AGM-45 Shrike, would be launched at any radar that illuminated an attacking aircraft, giving the North Vietnamese radar operators an unpleasant choice between tracking attacking aircraft and having a radar-homing missile come through their window. Fighter escorts would handle any MiG interceptors that the North Vietnamese chose to launch. It was a comprehensive plan. It reflected everything American naval aviation had learned in 7 years of combat over North Vietnam. What it could not fully account for was density. The sheer density of the defensive response that met the strike package on the morning of April 19th was beyond what the planning models had predicted, beyond what the electronic warfare assets could fully suppress, beyond what the suppression of enemy air defense aircraft could neutralize. The North Vietnamese had concentrated more defensive firepower in and around Haiphong than the American strike package could suppress, while simultaneously pressing its attacks on the harbor targets. And the North Vietnamese knew they had to defend Haiphong at all costs. Without the harbor, the Easter offensive would run out of fuel and ammunition within weeks. The men behind those guns and missile consoles were not defending a piece of geography. They were defending the viability of an entire military campaign, the survival of everything their country had been fighting for 30 years. They were not going to be suppressed easily. The moment the strike package crossed the Vietnamese coastline, the sky began to change. Pilots who have described that moment in later years reach for the same images again and again. The sky fills up. That is the phrase they use, each of them independently, decades apart, trying to describe the same phenomenon. The sky fills up with things that are trying to kill you, and the filling happens so quickly that there is no clear starting point. No moment where you look ahead and see nothing, and then look again and see missiles. One moment the sky is the sky, blue and open, and full of the ordinary hazards of carrier aviation. The next moment it is something else entirely. Something that doesn't correspond to any category you had previously used to organize the world. The SA-2 missiles came up in pairs and triplets and sometimes larger groups. The radar warning receivers in the cockpit screamed continuously, a tone specifically designed to be impossible to ignore. A sound that meant a radar was locked on you and a missile might be in the air. The correct response to a SAM launch was a hard, violent diving turn toward the missile, trying to force it to overshoot as it attempted to match your change in direction. But executing that maneuver required seeing the missile, tracking it, judging the right moment to brake, and flying a precise evasive pattern. All while your aircraft was carrying ordnance you were trying to deliver on target, while your wingman was trying to stay with you. While other missiles were in the air that you might not have seen yet, while the AAA was filling the sky with steel, and while the radio was erupting with urgent transmissions from other pilots in the strike package, who were in their own life-or-death situations at the same moment you were in yours. For some pilots, the training held. The thousands of hours in the simulator, the hundreds of hours practicing SAM evasion tactics over the Gulf, the careful study of debriefs from pilots who had been through it before, all of it crystallized in the cockpit into something like controlled instinct. They saw the missiles, broke correctly, defeated the shots, rolled back toward their targets, pressed their attacks, and made it out the other side damaged or undamaged to fight another day. For others, the mathematics simply didn't work out. A missile that you didn't see because you were focused on a different missile. A hit that took out a hydraulic system and left you without meaningful ability to maneuver. A piece of AAA fragmentation that penetrated the cockpit and removed your ability to do anything at all. Aircraft were going down. The radio calls that no one wants to make and no one wants to receive were filling the frequency. Mayday calls, bailout announcements, calls for rescue coordination, for search and rescue helicopters to be directed to coordinates in the water or over land. Every pilot in the strike package was processing two simultaneous streams of information. The immediate tactical information about the threats in his own immediate vicinity, and the broader situational awareness about how many of his fellow aviators were in trouble, where they were, whether anyone was getting out. In the compressed timeline of a 30-minute strike, with everyone flying at several hundred knots in a multi-axis assault on one of the most heavily defended cities on Earth, maintaining that situational awareness was almost impossibly demanding. The aircraft that made it to their targets and released their weapons did so under conditions that represent almost incomprehensible courage. Understanding that what they were flying into was essentially unsurvivable by any reasonable probability calculation, and flying into it anyway because the mission required it. Because training and discipline and unit cohesion and a fundamental commitment to not abandoning your fellow pilots required it, is the kind of thing that military historians spend careers trying to find adequate language to describe. The word bravery feels insufficient. The word heroism feels like it belongs to a different, cleaner kind of war. What those pilots did on April 19, 1972, was something more complicated and more painful than either of those words fully captures. The targets in Haiphong Harbor were real and important. The fuel storage facilities, the port infrastructure, the supply depots that fed the pipeline of material flowing south to sustain the Easter offensive. These were legitimate military targets of significant strategic value. And some of them were hit. Some of the ordnance delivered under those conditions by those pilots found its target and did the damage it was intended to do. The mission was not a complete failure in the tactical sense, but the cost at which those tactical results were purchased was staggering. And the gap between what the strike was supposed to accomplish and what it actually accomplished in terms of suppressing Haiphong's defensive capability was enormous. The debriefs that evening aboard the carriers were intensive and exhaustive. Every pilot who returned was questioned in detail about what he had seen, what he had experienced, what evasive actions had worked and which had not, what the missile firing patterns had looked like, where the heaviest AAA concentrations had been, what the radar warning receiver tones had sounded like, and how quickly missiles had appeared after those tones. The information from those debriefs fed directly into revised tactical planning, new electronic warfare techniques, adjustments to approach angles and altitudes, and ordnance release parameters. The United States Navy was learning in real time, the way military organizations always learn, by paying in lives for lessons that then have to be immediately applied to prevent paying in more lives tomorrow. Nixon's response to the situation in North Vietnam was escalating rapidly through April and into May of 1972. On May 8th, Nixon went on national television to announce Operation Linebacker, the comprehensive air campaign against North Vietnam that would include the mining of Haiphong Harbor. This was the public announcement of what the Navy had already been doing in less officially acknowledged ways. And it represented a dramatic escalation of American air power employment that the North Vietnamese had to know was coming and had to respond to. The mining of the harbor was particularly significant. By seeding Haiphong's approaches with naval mines, the United States effectively closed the port to Soviet and Chinese shipping, cutting off the flow of supplies that sustained the Easter offensive. Ships that tried to enter the harbor risked detonating a mine. Most of them turned around. The Soviet response to the mining of Haiphong was revealing. There were diplomatic protests, strongly worded statements, expressions of outrage through official channels, but there was no military response. Soviet warships that were in or near Haiphong when the mining operation was announced quietly repositioned themselves. Soviet freighters that were en route to Haiphong turned back. The Soviet Union was not going to go to war with the United States over North Vietnam, and both sides knew it. The geopolitical calculations that had protected Haiphong for 7 years turned out, when finally tested, to have significantly overestimated the Soviet commitment to defending North Vietnamese supply lines at the cost of direct superpower confrontation. But the mines and the diplomatic fallout and the geopolitical maneuvering were things that happened at levels far above the cockpit. For the pilots who kept flying combat missions over North Vietnam through the summer and fall of 1972, the reality was simpler and more immediate. The SAMs were still there. The guns were still there. The radar networks were still there, adapted and adjusted, and in some cases reinforced even as American strikes were trying to degrade them. Every mission over the North was a mission into a combat environment that remained extraordinarily lethal, that continued to demand everything that a trained combat aviator had in him, and sometimes demanded more than he had. The technological dimension of the air campaign over North Vietnam in 1972 deserves extended examination, because it represents one of the most significant periods of military technological evolution in the history of aerial warfare. Both sides were learning, both sides were adapting, and the pace of adaptation was compressed into weeks and months rather than the years that technology development normally requires. On the American side, the electronic warfare capabilities that had been rushed into service in the late 1960s were being continuously improved based on combat experience. The EA-6B Prowler, which had entered service only in 1971, was developing its capabilities in real combat conditions over some of the most heavily defended airspace in the world. The AGM-78 Standard Arm anti-radiation missile was providing a longer range, more capable alternative to the Shrike for attacking North Vietnamese radars. And the lessons being learned about the specific frequencies and operating patterns of Soviet-supplied radar systems were being fed back to electronic warfare engineers who were developing countermeasures to those specific systems. On the North Vietnamese side, the adaptation was equally sophisticated and arguably even more impressive given the resource constraints under which it operated. The North Vietnamese understood that their SA-2 missiles were most effective when the American pilots didn't know they were there. So they developed elaborate techniques for concealing their radar emissions until the last possible moment before launch, denying American pilots the radar warning receiver alert that would have given them time to execute evasive maneuvers. They moved their SAM batteries frequently, sometimes relocating an entire battery overnight to prevent American intelligence from targeting a position that had been identified in the previous day's reconnaissance photography. They developed camouflage techniques for SAM sites that made them extraordinarily difficult to spot from reconnaissance aircraft. And they created dummy sites to draw American anti-radiation missiles away from the real batteries. This was sophisticated, professional, operationally creative military thinking of a very high order. The psychological dimension of flying combat over Haiphong in 1972 is something that doesn't appear in official after-action reports, but is central to understanding what the pilots who flew those missions experienced and what the long-term consequences were for the men involved. Combat aviation is a profession that selects for a particular psychological type, men who are capable of performing complex technical tasks under extreme physical and emotional stress, who can compartmentalize fear in a way that allows them to function effectively in environments where functioning effectively is the difference between living and dying. Naval aviation adds to this the specific demands of carrier operations, the arrested landings, the night operations, the confined working environment of a ship at sea, the constant proximity to danger that is simply the background condition of life aboard a carrier air wing in combat. What Haiphong did to even the most psychologically robust of these men was cumulative. A single terrifying mission could be processed, debriefed, incorporated into experience, and moved past. A second terrifying mission built on the first, a third on the second. By the time a pilot had flown 5 or 6 missions into the Haiphong area in a compressed period, the cumulative weight of those experiences was beginning to produce effects that no amount of professional stoicism could entirely suppress. Sleep disturbances, hypervigilance, a characteristic flinching at sudden sounds that the men themselves recognized as abnormal but couldn't prevent, an altered relationship with risk and probability that showed up in subtle ways in the cockpit. These were the symptoms that would later be recognized as combat stress responses, and they were present throughout the air wings that flew the linebacker campaign. Recognized by the flight surgeons and the commanding officers, but rarely discussed openly, because the culture of naval aviation at that time had no framework for discussing them. The prisoners of war who were shot down over Haiphong and survived to be captured faced a different but equally terrible form of the same experience. The prison camps of Hanoi, the Hanoi Hilton being the most notorious, had been operating since 1965, receiving an increasingly large population of American aviators who had been shot down over North Vietnam. The treatment of these prisoners had been the subject of intense American anger, since accounts of torture and abuse had begun to emerge through returned prisoners and other sources. By 1972, some of the men captured in the earlier years of the war had been prisoners for 6 or 7 years. The shootdowns from Black Sunday and subsequent strikes during linebacker added fresh captives to a prison population that had developed its own extraordinary internal culture of resistance. Communication, mutual support, and maintenance of military structure, despite the efforts of their captors to destroy all of those things. The communication systems that the American POWs developed in the North Vietnamese prison camps are one of the remarkable organizational achievements of the Vietnam War. Unable to communicate openly, threatened with severe punishment for any contact between prisoners, the men developed a tap code, A matrix of letters communicated through patterns of taps on shared walls that allowed them to maintain communication, pass information, conduct informal command and control, and maintain the unit cohesion that was essential to their psychological survival. New prisoners who arrived after being shot down were quickly integrated into this system, briefed on the code, informed about the prison's structure and the behaviors of individual guards, and incorporated into the community of resistance. The pilots shot down in 1972, who survived capture and arrived in the prison camps found, to their astonishment, a functioning military organization operating in the most hostile and constrained conditions imaginable. The men who were not captured, who flew their missions and came back, who survived Black Sunday and continued to fly through Linebacker, carried their own burdens. The specific professional responsibility of leadership in a combat air wing during a period of serious losses is something that commanding officers and executive officers rarely discuss publicly. Every pilot who was shot down had been trained by someone, had been part of a community that included people who felt responsible for his well-being and effective operation. Every empty parking spot on the flight deck, every missing face at the squadron ready room briefing, every name added to the list of missing or captured was a weight that the leaders carried along with all of their other professional responsibilities. And those leaders still had to brief the next day's missions, still had to send men into the same environment that had claimed their predecessors, still had to project the confidence and professionalism that their units needed from them in order to function. The strategic outcome of Operation Linebacker is a complex and contested subject among military historians. On the one hand, the combination of Linebacker airstrikes and the mining of Haiphong Harbor did contribute significantly to the degradation of North Vietnam's ability to sustain the Easter offensive. The South Vietnamese military, supported by American air power, and no longer facing the overwhelming material superiority that Soviet supplies had provided, was eventually able to stabilize the front and push back against the Easter offensive's most dangerous thrusts. The offensive that had seemed in April as though it might collapse South Vietnam entirely was, by the end of the summer, contained. This outcome was not solely the result of air power, South Vietnamese military performance, American advisory support, and other factors all contributed, but Linebacker and the mining of Haiphong were significant elements. On the other hand, the losses incurred during Linebacker were significant, and the damage done to the North Vietnamese air defense system, despite some specific successes against individual SAM sites and radar installations, did not achieve the comprehensive suppression that would have allowed American aircraft to operate over the North without prohibitive losses. The SAM network absorbed strikes, relocated, repaired damage, and continued to function as an effective integrated air defense system throughout the campaign. The North Vietnamese had built redundancy and resilience into their air defense architecture, specifically because they knew they would be struck. And that architecture proved harder to eliminate than American strike planners had hoped. The diplomatic dimension of the 1972 air campaign eventually produced results that the military campaign alone had not been able to achieve. The combination of military pressure and diplomatic engagement through the Paris negotiations, Henry Kissinger meeting with Le Duc, though, in a series of talks that would eventually earn both men Nobel Peace Prize, an award that generated considerable controversy, was moving toward a ceasefire agreement by the fall of 1972. But then the agreement fell apart, and Nixon responded with the most intensive air campaign of the entire war. The 11-day Linebacker II operation in December 1972 that targeted Hanoi itself and became known as the Christmas bombing. Linebacker II generated enormous domestic and international controversy, but it produced results. The North Vietnamese came back to the negotiating table, and the Paris Peace Accords were signed in January 1973. The peace that those accords produced was temporary, as it turned out. North Vietnam was back on the offensive by 1975, and the final fall of Saigon on April 30th, 1975, rendered the whole complex costly. Morally complicated enterprise of the American military involvement in Vietnam, a historical argument that has never been fully resolved and probably never will be. Was it worth it? Could it have been won? Did the air campaigns over the North shorten the war or prolong it? These questions have been debated by historians and veterans and politicians for 50 years and will be debated for 50 more. But within that larger argument, the specific events of April 19, 1972, stand as something more particular and more immediate. They stand as a testament to what men can be asked to do and what some of them are capable of doing when asked. The pilots who flew into Haiphong Harbor on Black Sunday did not choose the air defense system they flew into. They did not design the strategic situation that required them to be there. They were professionals responding to orders given by a chain of command that extended from their immediate commanding officers up through the carrier captain, the task force commander, the theater commander, the Joint Chiefs, and ultimately to the President of the United States. Within that chain of obligation, they did what the mission required. Some of them died, some of them were captured. The survivors climbed out of their cockpits, were debriefed, ate their meals, tried to sleep, and prepared to do it again the next day. The classified nature of some of the details of Black Sunday and the subsequent linebacker strikes meant that, for years, the full human cost of what happened on April 19, 1972, was not publicly known. The Pentagon's public loss figures for individual operations were carefully managed, combining losses from multiple missions, using language that technically disclosed what was required, while minimizing the political impact of specific bad days. Families of men who were killed or captured received official notifications that told them the essential facts about their loved one's fate without providing the operational context that would have allowed them to understand what had happened and why. Declassification of specific operational records happened incrementally over decades, and the full picture has been assembled not from any single official source, but from the accumulated weight of pilot memoirs, declassified after-action reports, historical research, and the testimony of veterans who chose to speak about their experiences. The generation of naval aviators who flew the linebacker campaign returned from Vietnam and continued their careers, or separated from the service, or dealt in various ways with what they had experienced. Some of them became advocates for better treatment of combat veterans, better recognition of combat stress responses, better support for the families of men who had been killed or captured. Some of them became involved in the long fight to bring home American prisoners of war and to account for those listed as missing in action. A fight that continued for decades after the last American combat aircraft left Vietnamese airspace. Some of them simply got on with their lives, carrying what they carried quietly, in the way that their generation had been raised to understand that men carry difficult things. The aircraft carriers that launched those missions in April of 1972 are themselves now history. The USS Coral Sea was decommissioned in 1990 and scrapped. The USS Kitty Hawk served until 2009, the last conventionally powered carrier in the American fleet, and was sold for scrapping. The USS Constellation was decommissioned in 2003. The USS Hancock was decommissioned in 1976. The aircraft they carried are in museums or have been scrapped, or in some cases have been recovered from the bottom of the Gulf of Tonkin by Vietnamese fishermen who have no particular reason to be interested in the stories of the men who flew them. The physical artifacts of Black Sunday are dispersed and largely invisible, just as the event itself was for so many years. What remains and what demands acknowledgement is the human record. The names of the men who did not come back from Haiphong Harbor on April 19, 1972, and on the many days before and after that are contained within the same dark chapter. The names inscribed on the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, that long black wall of granite that has become one of the most visited and most emotionally powerful memorials in the country. Every name on that wall represents a story as specific and irreplaceable as the stories of the men who flew on Black Sunday. Every name represents parents who got a knock on the door, a spouse who had to tell children that their father wasn't coming home, friends who carried a loss that never entirely healed. The military lessons of Black Sunday and the broader linebacker campaign have been thoroughly studied and incorporated into American military doctrine in the decades since 1972. The development of stealth technology, which produces aircraft that are effectively invisible to radar-guided air defense systems, was directly driven by the experience of flying against sophisticated integrated air defense systems, like the one that defended Haiphong. The F-117 Nighthawk and the B-2 Spirit are direct descendants of the painful lessons learned over North Vietnam. The comprehensive suppression of enemy air defense as a distinct military mission, with dedicated training, specialized aircraft, and integrated planning, emerged from the recognition that going into an environment like Haiphong without defeating the defenses first was a form of institutional negligence that cost lives. The Navy's Top Gun School, which had been established in 1969, specifically to address the poor air-to-air performance of naval aviation in the early years of Vietnam, was part of a broader institutional response to the recognition that combat realities required different training and different thinking than peacetime professional norms had produced. The broader geopolitical context in which Black Sunday occurred has itself been transformed beyond recognition in the 50-plus years since April 19, 1972. The Soviet Union, whose military technology filled the batteries and guided the missiles that killed American pilots over Haiphong, ceased to exist in 1991. The Unified Socialist Republic of Vietnam and the United States established full diplomatic relations in 1995 and have developed a relationship of increasing economic and strategic cooperation, driven in part by shared concerns about Chinese regional ambitions. American Navy ships now make port calls in Haiphong. American and Vietnamese naval personnel exercise together. The harbor that was the center of one of the most intense and costly air campaigns in history is now a place where the two nations whose pilots and gunners were trying to kill each other in 1972 cooperate as partners in maintaining regional stability. History moves in directions that are genuinely impossible to predict from inside any particular moment. But the impossibility of predicting history from inside a particular moment is precisely the condition under which the men of April 19, 1972 were operating. They didn't know how it would end. They didn't know whether what they were doing would matter in the long run, whether South Vietnam would survive, whether the losses they were taking would be worth the strategic outcome, whether their names would be remembered or forgotten. They knew the mission, they knew the target, they knew the threat. And they flew anyway, into the most concentrated anti-aircraft fire in the history of American military aviation. Because that is what they had been trained to do, and because there was nobody else to do it. The story of Black Sunday is ultimately a story about the gap between what war looks like from a distance and what war looks like from inside a cockpit at the moment when the sky fills up with things that are trying to kill you. From a distance, the Vietnam War is a political and strategic argument that has never been fully resolved, and that continues to generate debate and disagreement about American foreign policy, military strategy, and the proper use of national power. From inside a cockpit over Haiphong Harbor on April 19, 1972, it was 42 men trying to survive 30 minutes in a sky that had been engineered for their destruction. Both of these perspectives are true. Both of them are necessary for understanding what actually happened, and neither of them by itself is sufficient. The men who flew on Black Sunday, the ones who came back and the ones who didn't, deserve to have their story told in its full complexity, its full human weight, its full moral seriousness. They deserve to have the classified documents declassified, the operational details examined, the costs acknowledged, and the courage recognized without being predified into something cleaner and simpler than it was. War is not clean and simple. Naval aviation over North Vietnam in 1972 was not clean and simple. The men who flew those missions knew exactly how not clean and simple it was, and they flew anyway. So the next time you see a Navy aircraft flying overhead, the next time you see images of carrier flight operations on the news, the next time you hear about American naval power being projected in some distant part of the world, remember April 19, 1972. Remember the 42 men who climbed into their cockpits that morning. Remember the sky filling up with missiles and fire. Remember what was asked of them and what they gave. Remember that the freedom to have the arguments we have about American foreign policy and military strategy, the freedom to criticize and question and demand accountability, exists in part because men like those were willing to fly into Haiphong Harbor on a morning in April, when the mathematics of survival had essentially broken down. That is what Black Sunday was. That is what it means. That is why more than 50 years later it still matters. And that is why the story of what happened on April 19, 1972, over Haiphong Harbor, deserves to be told, examined, and remembered as long as there are people who believe that the experiences of the men and women who fight wars on behalf of their nations are worthy of serious historical attention and genuine human respect. If you have made it to this point in this story, I want to ask you something directly. Not as a content creator asking for engagement, but as someone who has spent real time inside this history, trying to understand what those men went through and why it matters. Do you think the American public, in 1972 and in the decades since, has ever truly reckoned with what was asked of the men who flew the linebacker campaign? Do you think we have adequately honored the specific sacrifices of naval aviators in Vietnam, as distinct from the broader and better-known narratives of the ground war? And do you think history has been fair to the men who flew on Black Sunday? Or has the political complexity of the Vietnam War made it too easy to look past their individual stories into the larger argument about whether the war itself was justified? I am genuinely asking you to think about those questions. And if you found this story valuable, if you found it told you something you didn't know or helped you understand something you'd never been given the full context to understand, then please share it with someone who you think deserves to know it. Because these stories belong to all of us. They are part of what we are. As a nation, and as people who live in a world that was shaped by the decisions made in those cockpits, and those ready rooms, and those Pentagon briefing rooms in the spring of 1972.